Hi there. Let's take a map tour of Bolivia, one of the most unique countries in the Americas. Bolivia is in South America, and it's right in the heart of South America. You can see that because on the map, you can see that Bolivia has five different neighboring countries: Peru, Brazil, Paraguay, Argentina, and Chile. So it's in the middle of a lot of things. We can start the tour in the northwest corner of Bolivia, up where it says La Paz. La Paz means peace, the peace in Spanish. And La Paz is the highest capital city in the world. And it's a very, very indigenous city. There's lots of indigenous people, especially Aymara and Quechua people. And that's because Bolivia has the highest percentage of indigenous people of any country in the Americas, highest percentage of indigenous people. And these indigenous people, the main two tribes, Aymara and Quechua, are descendants of the Incas. In fact, the Quechua language was the language of the Incas, and it's still spoken today. So the Inca language didn't go anywhere. So that's the highest capital in the world, La Paz. And not far from there, you can see there's a major lake up in the northwest corner, Lake Titicaca. Great name. And on that lake is an island, the Isla del Sol, Island of the Sun, where the Incas believed that their original ancestors and the Inca gods sprouted out of that island. You can see the island right next to the A in La Paz. It's right there in the lake. You can take a boat out to that island. You can camp there overnight, Isla del Sol. So half of Lake Titicaca on the north is in Peru, and the other half is in Bolivia on the southern side. That's a very high altitude lake. And it's actually part of a larger lake system, many of which are no longer there. There are lots of paleo lakes or ancient prehistoric lakes that used to be up there as well on what we call the Altiplano. See the word Altiplano that comes down from La Paz and Lake Titicaca? Altiplano means high plain. So it's the second highest plateau in the world. And you can see it stretches down all the way from the north of Bolivia down to the southern part there where it says Salar de Uyuni. Salar means a salt flats, and Uyuni is the place. And so that is a salt flat that is the world's largest salt flats. That layer of salt there is bigger than, it's about the same size as Jamaica, the country, very large. Not many people live in this area. These are very remote regions like the Salar de Uyuni, the south part of the Altiplano there. But more in the northern part of the Altiplano, you do have Aymara indigenous people, and you have in La Paz, you have lots of different types of people, but especially indigenous people there too. So you have a lot of unusual landscapes. You have the top of the Altiplano, the northern side, you got the lake that the Incas believe that they originated from. And at the bottom, you have this huge salt flat, Salar de Uyuni, which has pink flamingos. If you look up pictures of that, it's a very surreal landscape, Uyuni salt flats. So how did this salt get there? Because there used to be a lake on top of that too. But that paleo lake dried up, and then the salt that was in it left behind and get the salt flats. Okay, so it's a very unusual landscape there. And you see the white of the peaks of those mountains in the Andes, and you also see the white of the salt in the Salar de Uyuni on the map. So what's happening here on that side of Bolivia is, this is more the ancient Inca side. And what's happening is the Andes Mountains there, it goes up and down from the top of South America all the way to the bottom of South America. The Andes Mountains, the ridges of the Andes are actually kind of bowing out and splitting and fork into two separate ridges on either side like this. And that's either side of the Altiplano. So if you look in the map, you see the eastern side of the Altiplano, there's the Cordillera Real, which is the Royal Ridge. And then the other side, there's another ridge on the western side. And then in between, so if you imagine you have these two ridges on either side, the western ridge and the eastern ridge. And in between that, all of this sediment piled up in there in the V shape between the ridges on either side, like this V, piled up, and then it make this big kind of flat bottom that's the Altiplano kind of basin there between the plain between the two ridges of the Andes. A very unusual landscape. Then what happens later is that the ridges come back together again and you keep going into Argentina. So that's the western side of Bolivia, and that's a place where there's a lot of lithium up in those mountains, and Bolivia is trying to capitalize on that and take advantage of the lithium industry because lithium is necessary for electric car batteries, cell phones, a lot of high-tech appliances. So they have potential for a future industry to really, really grow in lithium. They already got started in lithium, but they have a lot of upside in that. So if we go from the western side of Bolivia, it was the ancient home of the Incas, today Aymara and Quechua, and we cross over, we can see there's a lot of ridges of these mountains in the area in the sort of the middle of Bolivia between the Altiplano and then the lowlands on the eastern side. So what's happening is we're going from a high altitude in the Andes, and we're going to be sloping down all the way out to the Amazon in the northeastern part of Bolivia. And then in the southeastern part, it's not the Amazon, it's called the Chaco. You can see at the bottom there, it says Gran Chaco, the big Chaco. The Chaco is a grassland, very hot grassland. Okay, so the northern part of eastern Bolivia is Amazon, and the southern part is Chaco. Before we get there, let's look at what's in the middle. So between the Altiplano and the Amazon and the Chaco are a lot of major cities in Bolivia. One is Cochabamba. You see there, Cochabamba is a city that sends a lot of Bolivians to the United States. I used to work in a community college in Northern Virginia, literally across Route 7 from South Arlington, Virginia, which is the largest Bolivian community in the United States. And a lot of those people came from Cochabamba. It's a working city. It's got a lot of industries, and it's also a hub city for many, many farms all around that area, which are mostly Quechua people in villages. They grow peaches and apples and things like that. So Cochabamba, a real hub city in the middle of Bolivia. Below that, you see Potosi. Potosi is an historic city because the Spanish colonists mined silver there. And in fact, that became the source of silver for the Spanish in the Americas. It was so much silver coming out of there, it made the Spanish incredibly wealthy. Just that one particular mountain called Cerro Rico, it's actually higher than La Paz. La Paz is the highest capital in the world, but Potosi, the town, the mining town, is even higher than that. And if you look online, you see little research. Unfortunately, indigenous labor was used to do that mining in the Spanish colonial era. And they still mine there today, but they used a lot of mercury to separate the silver. And so a lot of indigenous people got mercury poisoning, which is really, really bad way to die. So it's real tragedy historically what happened in Potosi. But that, imagine if you could dig into the world and dig up money, just dig up $100 bills. That's basically what it was. They were digging silver out of a mountain, and then you could go spend that anywhere in Europe. Off to the southeast of Potosi is Sucre. So Bolivia has two capitals. It's got a legislative executive capital, which is La Paz. We already saw that, the highest capital in the world. But the judicial part of the government is in Sucre, so it's the judicial capital. And Sucre also is called the White City because all the buildings downtown are white, all painted white. So it's a very different look from La Paz. La Paz is kind of a hodgepodge of different types of uses and buildings and styles, but Sucre is very uniform and orderly. So it's called the White City, Sucre. And so you might think they're not that far apart. I could probably drive from Sucre to Potosi in about 45 minutes or something like that. But actually, these cities being in those lots and lots of ridges of those mountains there, it takes a long time by car or bus to go from just Cochabamba to Potosi, for example, or Cochabamba to La Paz. It could be 5, 6, 7, 8 hours. And so in Bolivia, they have lots of cheap flights. They have their own internal airlines, and they have $40, $30, $50 flights. You can just kind of bounce on internal flights between these cities for a relatively low amount of money. Before we move out of the middle of Bolivia, between the super high Altiplano and then the sea level Chaco and Amazon, I'll mention one thing about the bottom there where it says Tarija, in the bottom of Bolivia. It's a lesser known city. It's kind of on the way down on the slopes. So it's not too high, but it's not sea level either. And so Tarija, the climate is not cold. It's not cool. I should say La Paz and the Altiplano that we started with, that whole area is chilly. It's like maybe in Fahrenheit about 50 degrees. It's like kind of October weather. October, people wearing like leather jackets, sweaters, multiple layers. It's one of the indigenous women there. They wore lots and lots of layers partly because it's so cold. So Tarija is not like that. Tarija is very mild. It's like a great climate. So if you ever want to kind of go off the beaten path in Bolivia, it's pretty far from everything else. It's more like on the way to Argentina, but it's known for its really nice climate, really pleasant. It's in wine country and apples and grapes, things you can get there. So it's a nice little nook within Bolivia. So if you move out of the mountains and we go down the slopes, we go out to the eastern part of Bolivia. It's really almost another world. It's another world. The Inca world was up there. This is the world of the Guarani. Guarani is a different tribe. It's not Incas in the past. It's not Aymara and Quechua, the descendants of the Incas. It's a different group of people. This is the tribe that extends into Paraguay. In fact, it's so popular in Paraguay, this tribe, that the national language of Paraguay is Guarani. It's even spoken more than Spanish. Spanish is like 90% of people speak Spanish in Paraguay. 96% speak Guarani. And most people in Paraguay have some Guarani ancestry mixed with European. And even the money in Paraguay is called the Guarani. It's the name of the currency. So obviously it's a big deal, this tribe out there. And they dominate the lowlands there, the flat Chaco area, which extends into Paraguay. So that Chaco, you can imagine, it's a very hot area because there's no ocean anywhere. This is a landlocked country, Bolivia, connecting with another landlocked country, Paraguay. So there's no moderating effect, the maritime effect of the seas to moderate temperatures, bring down hot temperatures, bring up cool temperatures. So that Chaco is hot. And it has become a major plantation center for soybeans, corn, things like that. Just like northern Argentina and Brazil and places like that are also. This is a real big soybean exporter, corn exporting area of the world. This whole area right here with Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, and the southeast part of Bolivia. So in Bolivia, the key hub city of the Chaco is Santa Cruz. You see Santa Cruz, the city within Santa Cruz, the department. Santa Cruz has really been developing quickly in the last, say, 60 to 70, 80 years, since the mid 20th century. And that's because there's been a lot of immigration to that area because they discovered gas, fossil fuels in the last century. And all the North American fossil fuel corporations came down there exploring, and then the engineers came down and they really exploited that resource. And today, natural gas is a huge part of Bolivia's economy. Bolivia transitioned from sort of the old guard, colonial era remnants governing Bolivia for ages. And then in the 2000s, their first indigenous president, Evo Morales, was elected. And he did some good things, he did some bad things. And one of the things that he did, which is debatable about how it turned out, is he socialized the economy and he took over the government control of the natural gas industry. What he did was he had the companies that were producing it have to give it to the government, and then the government would give it to the people. So the government would pay them for it. So that's very controversial. So Santa Cruz is a hub of that. There's a lot of money coming in from the natural gas industry, but it's also in the midst of a huge tropical plantation area as well. So they have multiple things going on there in terms of primary industries, the fossil fuels, and also lots of plantations. If you go to Santa Cruz, you also see occasionally Mennonites walking around. Mennonites from Europe immigrated there. They just kind of like the Amish people in the United States. They want to be left alone, do their thing. And it's one of many places in the Americas where the Mennonites moved to. So now people in Santa Cruz and in eastern Bolivia there, don't really, there's kind of a tension big time between that side of the country and the western side of the country that we started with. So the people up in the mountains, they call Collas, Collas. And the people in the eastern Bolivia, they call Cambas, Collas and Cambas. And they're, I don't know, rivals, or they don't always like each other for multiple reasons. They're just different cultures. But beyond that, part of it is that Santa Cruz is a real hub of business and development, capitalism, advancement. Whereas all of a sudden, in the mid 2000s, a socialist government comes in and says, "Hey, we're going to nationalize some of those industries, that oil and gas," and say, "Okay." People got afraid that these governments are going to take all the stuff that they've worked so hard to produce. So that's a big tension. And if you go to Santa Cruz and you ask them about the government in La Paz, you'll get a lot of different answers, but there's a lot of discord and disagreement between the two sides and many people, especially entrepreneurs, business people in Santa Cruz. So there was even talk of the eastern side of Bolivia there seceding and breaking away from the rest of Bolivia, but that's probably not going to happen. One other thing before we leave this region around Santa Cruz is right above Santa Cruz, just above it, kind of where my pointer is right in here. There's actually a historic chain of Jesuit, as in the Catholic order of priests, Jesuit missions. So the churches and the housing that they used to use when the Jesuits set up colonial missions there. And they had indigenous people working there and things like that in the past, in centuries past. So you can still see them, but they're not operating, but they are UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and they're actually in the jungle. So if you just drive out into the jungle, you can see these Jesuit missions still standing there. It's a very unusual thing, the contrast between the nature and then these historic colonial missions. So just to be clear, now we're going to go up to the northeastern part of Bolivia. And you see this river system that's right, kind of dendritic river system that's fanning out over the plains here. And where this is going is the Amazon. So if we follow this river, the Mamore River out here, up into, it's on the border between Brazil and Bolivia, these rivers, they go up, up, up. And where do they end up? Well, they ultimately end up in the Amazon River because they're part of the Amazon watershed, One thing I read about that I really like to do is that there's actually industrial shipping boats that go up and down these, and you can pay them a few bucks and they'll let you just sit on the deck and they'll cart you right up there, up the Amazon. So you bring a lunch and you spend 8 hours on that boat. You just get a really amazing view of this Amazonian area up here on the border. And also one other interesting note is that Bolivia has a navy. You might think, well, what does a landlocked country do with a navy? Right? But what they do is they patrol and monitor Lake Titicaca up in the northwest, and they also patrol and monitor these border rivers with Brazil for illegal drug trade and things like that. So there is a navy and they're active. They basically monitor both sides of the country. So up in the northeast of Bolivia, it's probably the most remote area of Bolivia, this northeastern part, and then also the southwestern part as well, on the deep altiplano on the southern side. But up here, you're basically now in the Amazon. This is the bottom edge of the Amazon rainforest up here. And so to get there, what you would do is typically take a flight from, say, La Paz over here, and it's take forever by car, but it would take not that long by plane because it's just a straight shot to Roranabaque, that city right there at the foothills of the Andes there. And on that flight, just visualize it if you look at the three-dimensional map, right? So what would that be? Well, you're going to look out the window from La Paz, you're going to see all the tips of these mountains below you as you fly, because you're already in the highest capital in the world when you start. And then once you get to the edge right here, where it says Yungas, you're going to fall off the cliff, literally, so to speak, down that slope. So that last part of that journey, people have done it, have told me this. That last part of that journey, when you're just coming from La Paz to Cuernavaca, you're going high, 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 and then you just basically dive down to Cuernavaca. So it's a pretty wild ride. You see that you're at an angle and you see Cuernavaca below you out front. So that city is a gateway to Amazonian Bolivia up here. And there's national parks, Madidi National Park up here, which has literally some of the highest levels of species richness of biodiversity, tropical biodiversity in the Amazon in the world, in terms of butterflies and birds and things like that. Just hundreds and hundreds within a small amount of space. There are guides, and you can have the guide drive you out. You can take some of these rivers on boats, but this whole area in the top is the Amazon, and it's a place in the Amazon that gets less tourists, fewer tourists than some of the other hot spots in the Amazon that you might enter from. So if you really want to be sort of out there and experience the Amazon without lots of tourists around, it's a good spot to go because it really is a lot of biodiversity up there. So this is the Amazon rainforest. This is the Chaco in the bottom, grassland plains. And then as we come back around, moving counterclockwise, we get this middle part up here where it's not as wide as the southern part of Bolivia, but it's on the way to La Paz is an area called Las Yungas, which you see there in the mountains. And this is the lower mountains as you're kind of coming down from the high peaks of the Andes and the Altiplano. And the Yungas is a heavily forested area along the slopes of these foothills. Very high density of species there as well. And that's because the Yungas is what you call in ecology an ecotone. An ecotone is a transition zone in between where you have one type of ecosystem over here, and then you have a different type of ecosystem B over here. And then in the transition, what happens is some of the species that live over here, they migrate in there in the ecotone. And some of the species from over here in this ecosystem B, they migrate into the ecotone. So now you got species A and species B, species from B, right? Species from both sides. But then on top of that, ecotones have their own unique species called ecotone species who just live in ecotones. So you have like 1, 2, 3 different contributors to the ecosystem in terms of the amount of species. So ecotones in general get like a lot of species. They have more species in the ecotone in the middle than you have on either side. And that's the case with the Yungas. It's a very, very, very high level of species richness, biodiversity in there, in the foothills. And it's easier to access because it's not as high as these huge peaks up here. So, and I will say also, there's also an area similar to that down here, which I actually went to myself. So I took a SUV from Santa Cruz and I went west up, right on the edges of these mountains. There's towns which are in the middle of that ecotone, where this grassland ecosystem transitions to the mountain ecosystem out here, and in the middle, it's kind of gets the best of both worlds. You get species from both sides. I remember there was this guy from, a professional bird watcher, a scientist from Argentina who had set up business there, and he was taking people from all over the world on bird watching tours and jaguar watching tours and things like that. So it's difficult to find jaguars. It's like a 3 or 4 day trek. That's what he did. So the Yungas, these ecotone areas. And one other thing about the Yungas that's interesting is that it has what's sometimes called the world's most dangerous road, the Yungas Road. And I have not been on it. I would not recommend at all that you go on it either. But it is interesting to see it. If you look online and just type in Yungas Road and Google it, you'll see that there's different feature videos on it. But Mitsubishi made a video where they tested one of their cars. I guess they're one of their 4x4s to see if it could drive along this road. It's basically a road carved into the side of a mountain with no guardrails at all. And the tire is literally like inches away from the edge. So you can just literally just drop right off. Many people have died on that road, but they successfully drive along the Yungas Road. So I don't in any way recommend that you do that, but it's something interesting to see, the Yungas Road. Okay, so that's a look at Bolivia. You can see that this is a country has so many different diverse types of landscapes and not that much space. You could all pack together here, from the world's largest salt flats over here to the Amazon, from this high altitude historic lake where the Incas came from, Lake Titicaca, to this Chaco out here where Jesuits set up missions in the grasslands, indigenous people. And it's got ancient, it's got modern. And Bolivia is really a country that is developing, and they're landlocked. They do have a way of getting to the sea. They use Chile's port, so they have an agreement with Chile where they can send goods out through the highway, down the mountains, and then out to the Pacific Ocean. Historically, they had a port on the Pacific Ocean, but they lost it in a war with Chile a long time ago. And since then, they just use one of Chile's ports or several of Chile's ports as their exit point. So they can get to the ocean. It's just a little more work. So Bolivia is really a place, it's for real travelers who want to get away from the beaten path. And like I said, it's the Yungas Road has no guardrails, and Bolivia is kind of a no guardrails country, meaning it's pretty raw. But nature is there waiting. The Amazon's there waiting. This deep Chaco back here, deep Altiplano, all very raw landscapes, all almost surreal, all very natural. So if you go there to Bolivia and you poke out and explore, there's a lot to see.